afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is week 7, is that what we're in? Yeah, we're in week 7. So we are making the transition this week into the doctrine of essence. This will be the kind of final, the second of the two parts of the objective logic, and the part that we'll focus on for the rest of the quarter. There's plenty enough here to work on. There's plenty enough, obviously, in the doctrine of being to fill up an entire, I don't know, year or two's worth of exploration. So if you don't get every jot and tittle of every last bit of the doctrine of being, doctrine of essence, you're okay, right? So don't feel like if you didn't master every last thing, you've missed everything, or you're going to miss everything. You'll miss significant stuff, but you won't miss everything. I will try to, and that's what I'm about to try to do, is reconstruct for you, right? I always try to provide a kind of pathway through what we've already done by way of review, give you a pathway of what we've already done. That's what I'm about to try to do, summarizing those 3 statements, let's call that for the moment. We'll focus on the last one because that's where we left class off with last time, with that move. Then we'll launch into the stuff here. And if you read the stuff and you thought, that stuff on shine, right? He said nothing a lot, right? You can hear that in both senses, right? He said the word nothing a lot, and he may have said nothing, right? Absolutely, because he says, he defines reflection at one point as the nothing of the nothing that nothing. So literally how he defines it, right? So if you found that perplexing, you're in the same boat as everybody else who's reading that text. If you then feel perplexed about why he then starts talking about positing and extrinsic or external and determining reflection, you should feel perplexed by that. And then if you feel even more perplexed by why he then starts talking about identity, difference, and contradiction, you're in the right boat, right? So if all that perplexed you, if you felt like all that was set you astray, you're right. Most people who read that material think that. Having said that, I will just note a couple of things, and that's one is this. The shine material is incredibly important. It's literally, shine is the redefinition of being, right? It's the redefinition of being, of what that is. And from the perspective of essence, and we'll talk about what that is and how that works and make sense of that. The discussion about the 3 kinds of reflection, which you should have recognized at least one of them, right? Extrinsic reflection is taken over almost wholeheartedly, whole cloth from Kant, right? So that's there. Determining reflection is also a version of it, is in Kant. He seems to be talking about things that are in the tradition, not in the way the tradition actually receives them, but in the traditional way. If you think that, why is he talking about reflection? It's a good question to ask. Why he's doing that is incredibly important, but maybe not in the way you standardly think, because he actually doesn't mean by reflection what we standardly think he might mean by reflection. And he tells you that, right? You just forget it by the time you get to that stuff, right? But he tells you, I don't mean by reflection what you standardly think we mean by reflection. No surprise there. And then the material on identity, difference, and contradiction that ends the discussion, we'll save ground for next week. We'll get to the ground material next week, obviously. But it's related to contradiction, right? It's because, well, we'll get there when we get there, but that discussion is famous for a number of reasons, right? Most famous because just about everybody in French philosophy who wants to say there's a problem with Hegel will give you some version of what the problem with Hegel is he's a thinker of difference, right? Which is a good thing in their view. He is thinking difference. He's not thinking identity as the master concept at all times. He is giving us a conception of difference. But his conception of difference, as we can see in that very section, is a conception of difference that's ultimately subordinate to sublation. It can be taken up into a form of identity known as ground. And that's because he thinks difference as contradiction. He thinks difference as contradiction. So you'll see this in Deleuze, you see this in Derrida all the time. Their sort of tagline for this is, Hegel pushes difference up to, that's the way they usually express it, up to contradiction. Because they think difference is contradiction, because they restricted, Derrida will say, there's a teleological constriction of difference to think it as contradiction. And that teleological constriction, that on the way towards, right, the teleology of it, is to show that it's ultimately subsumable within a new form of identity, a broader form of identity, but still totalization and what all follows from that. You'll see the same thing, a version of the same basic argument going on in Deleuze, where Deleuze will say this is a way of thinking about difference. Hegel has a way of thinking about difference that's ultimately, and this is deadly for Deleuze, right, as we should know, anthropological. Right? It's anthropological. Right? That's what the notion of contradiction ultimately is from them. Now, both of them are getting that from Hippolyte. right? It comes straight out of Hippolyte's reading in Logic and Existence. It's almost verbatim. They both taken various elements out of that reading in the part 2 of Logic and Existence of this very material. And we'll have a lot more to say about it when we get there, but that's why that material is really significant. In external terms, just right, in terms of people reading Hegel, this is a lot of times where people will go and say, okay, he's a thinker of difference, but he is an insufficient thinker of difference because he constricts or restricts difference here, and we see that obviously going on here. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about it more in terms of the flow of the actual argument itself, and that'll give us, I think, pause to rethink how it's been used outside of that context, but nonetheless, that's where it goes. All right. Having said that, let me just note one thing. I'm going to end at 6:15. I know I'm the one who always takes us over, so I'm speaking to me more than you guys. But I'm going to end at 6:15 tonight. I have commitments that will take me out of class immediately after class, so I'll end at 6:15. I'll be watching the clock. You guys don't have to do so. But if you need to see me, you need to talk with me before then, catch me during the break. We can talk then. All right, questions, issues, problems, things you want to come back to? Everyone's mastered the text thus far, so there's no problem. It's all, Kevin, it's all fairly obvious, right? At this point, it's all, let's just be clear, right? I mean, these things, right? To be is to be measured, I mean, we all know that. To be measured is to be measured, come on. And then, of course, to be measureless is essence. I mean, yeah, come on. Who doesn't? No one. Right? So hopefully, that will help us work our way back through. So I mean these to be statements to be thought of this way. You can think of the science of logic as one massive explication of what it is to be. So you can do a to be statement on any one of the claims he's making and say, well, he's claiming that to be, right, for anything to be at all. And that's what he means with it, for it to be at all in any sense of the word term whatsoever. Then it's this, right? It's this. So when he says, right, that what it is to be in its most fundamental determination is to be measured, then it's worth stopping and thinking about that. When he says that to be that is to be measureless, it's important enough to take that serious and think about, because he's literally saying anything that exists, anything insofar as it is at all, anything that you can ascribe or that we would ascribe or that exists in any sense of the term whatsoever, it is measured. And because it's measured, it's measureless. And because it's measureless, this is the harder pill to swallow, it's essence. We'll try to make that last one work, because that one's pretty hard, right, to make the transition. And I'll suggest that it was hard for Hegel. Right? We'll come back to that point in just a little bit. All right. So let me just walk us through these three claims. I'll focus on the last one. But let me use the three claims as a way of reviewing where we are in the logic thus far, and then we'll be into essence itself. So to be is to be measured. Measure, we said, is the necessary interdependence of quantity and quality, by virtue of which anything is. That is, anything is discrete, it's real, it's an entity. And it is an entity because it's both quantitative and qualitative determinations, reality and discreteness, in relationship to one another. So recall how Hegel argues for that claim, that to be is to be measured. Hegel claims that the imminent necessary unfolding of quantity proved it to be quality. So quantity proves itself to be quality. He writes, this is on page 279, 320 in the German, by being thus posited as it is in conformity to its concept, quantum has passed over into another determination. It, quantity as quantum, has become the other of itself, namely quality. So the truth of quantity is quality. But how did quantity show itself to be quality? Let's just remind ourselves of that. What constitutes quantity precisely as quantity, what he calls its own proper moment, what makes quantity quantity, is nothing other than its process of continually overcoming of itself. It's quantitative, we called it infinitizing. Quantity is what it is in and through being other than what it is, that is, in its changing, its altering, its alteration. And in the ratio of powers, as we talked about last week, we see that this altering is nothing other than quantity raising itself to itself, becoming itself, precisely by differing from itself. So A raised to the power of A is the way of understanding the ratio, the relation by which this quantity is generative of itself. So the quality of quantity, its own most proper moment, its reality, is thus nothing other than the very movement that is quantity itself, right? So that's Hegel's argument. Quantity, you thought of as just a mass. You thought of it as just a quantum. You thought of it was just a unit or a sum. It's not. It's all those things, yes. It has all those determinations, but all those determinations arise and emerge out of the fact that quantity at its core, just like quality at its most core, is a process of infinitizing, where it constantly overcomes itself, not because something's making it do that, externally or extrinsically, imposing itself on it, but because it does that of itself, right? That's its immanent unfolding of itself. So the quality of quantity is thus nothing other than the very movement that is quantity itself. Hence, quantity, as quantitative infinity, as proportion, has proved to be quality, and this, as Hegel concludes, passes over of itself into, and thus it passes over of itself into quality. So that argument I laid out, it's in the, it's on D2L, I won't replay it here, is the claim that quantity is the truth of quality. We know that move. Then quality proves out to be the truth of quantity. So there's a double transition of quantity into quality, quality into quantity. So they're doubly transitioned into one another. One comes to be in the other comes to be in the other of itself. So he says, well, that means that what names that double transition into one another is just measure. So Hegel's claim at that point, if you just stopped him at that moment, he said, okay, what are you saying about the nature of reality? He's saying about the nature of reality, I'm saying that literally everything that exists, I don't care if it exists as a natural entity, as a non-natural entity, I don't care if it's a figment of your imagination, I don't care what it is. Anything insofar as it exists, insofar as it is, has a qualitative reality and a quantitative discreteness about it. And those two are mutually implicative with regard to one another. They're both processes, yes, but they're mutually implicative of one another. That means they set the boundaries to one another. They set the limits of one another. They measure one another. And everything that exists, insofar as it exists at all, has that character about it. Makes some sense? To be is to be measured. That's what that claim means. Now, very quickly, he wants to say, okay, if that's right, then that means everything is inherently measureless. Well, wait a minute, I thought we just got the setting of boundaries, right? Quantity sets the boundary on quality, quality sets the boundary on measure, on the boundary on quantity. They measure one another, they are specifying real measures for one another. Hegel's going to say, right, they look like they do that, right? And that sets us in this position of what we talked about before, the nodal line, right? This line of continuity with these changes going on up and down. These are qualitative changes, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And here's the quantitative persistence, the continuity that goes on. So there's the nodal line. So Hegel's literally saying to be measured is to be that. Everything insofar as it exists, everything insofar as it exists, from this bottle to this cell phone, to the table, to you and I, to our thoughts, everything, that insofar as it doesn't matter what kind of being we're talking about at this point. All being is nodal line at its core, every last bit of it. Now, if that's true, he thinks he's been able to show that it's incontrovertible because it's been shown to imminently and necessarily unfold. If he's right and he hasn't introduced any extraneous kind of claims, any presuppositions that have been brought into this, then all we're doing is just unfolding the thought of being, and that is being itself. Then what we've been able to show is that all that exists is in fact the nodal line. Everything is, you could say, nodal lines. But if that's right, then that nodal line can't stop going to increase and can't stop going to decrease. There is no boundary, there is no starting place, there is no ending place. There's always a non-finite infinity at either end, either the highest, the grandest, the biggest, the greatest, but also at the other end of it, the smallest, the infinitesimal, the most small, right, the most minuscule. And there's no boundary to either one. If that's the case, which he thinks he's been able to show, then qualitative and quantitative infinity can't set the boundary to one another. And therefore measure is necessarily, not just, damn it, we messed up on this one, oh my God, this one got going and we should be able to stop it. No, that's the nature of literally everything that is that it's measureless by virtue of being measured. Because it's qualitative and quantitative bounding of one another, that To use the examples I used last time, right? If you have a liquid state and increase the heat on it, it changes over to steam, right? That goes, and you can go down the other way. If you decrease the temperature, liquid state decreases down to ice, right? That's the qualitative states changing, as Hegel will call it. Because the abiding process underneath it is changing. That means the states are changing. There's continuity in the quantitative, there's qualitative shifts, right? Dramatic shifts at the level of the states. Then there's really no boundary setting to those processes either getting higher or getting lower. Yeah. Does that make some sense to everyone? So you can say there's a paradox at the core of the doctrine of being according to Hegel. There's a deep and fundamental paradox. And that paradox is everything is what it is by virtue of its qualitative and quantitative determinations. And all we mean by qualitative and quantitative determinations at this level is qualitatively it's real. So it has some degree of reality. And it has some degree of discreteness and continuity. That's all we mean by quantitative determination at this point. So everything that exists has those two features about it, those two aspects about it that are definitive of what it is to be. And they should measure one another. And in fact, they do. They do set boundaries on one another. But those boundaries, those limits, are always restrictions. To put it in the language of qualitative, it's a grenze, a limit that's always becomes a schranke, a constriction, right? A restriction that is overturned, surpassed, transcended because of what quality and quantity are inherently. So to be is to be measured, to be measured is to be measureless. So far, so good. So take a look with me on 323 again for just a moment. Page 323 in the English, this is 369 in the German. He says there, right in the middle of the page on 323, this is just above 370 in the German, he writes, in the nodal lines of measures, this determinateness is at the same time posited as specified. So it's doing what it's supposed to do, right? It's setting off the boundaries, what specification means, right? It sets off the boundaries of the quality against the quantity against the quantity. It works, is what he's saying. The abstract measureless sublates itself into qualitative determinateness. The new measure relation to which the original passes over is measureless with respect to the latter, right? So here's where the problem is. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing, but every specification is a limit that's transcended. The measure is always never, I should say, ultimately determined. The new measure relation to which the original passes over is measureless with respect to the latter. But in it, it equally is a quality that exists for itself. So here we go again. It's repetition, right? Repetition of just greater and greater or lesser and lesser determination. What is thus posited is the alternation. We're constantly flipping over for new quality, new quality, new quality, new qualitative determinations of specific existences with one another, and equally of them with relations that still remain merely quantitative, an alternation ad infinitum. And you know at this point that that's Hegel's name for, that's his signal for, this is a measurelessness, what he would call it earlier a spurious or bad infinity, that is the infinity, it's real, it's there, but it's just an infinity that is not finite. Infinity that is not finite. So you could call the qualitative sense of infinitizing or infinity here is the eruption of the infinite and the finite as an immediate transition or passing over the finite into its always receding beyond. The qualitative finite becomes the infinite, right? It's constantly moving towards that qualitative side. The quantitative is doing the same thing. They're both measureless within themselves. They're both spurious forms of infinity. Well, you'll say, well, wait a minute. Right? You rightly ought to pause at this point and say, well, excuse me, Hegel, didn't you show us with respect to qualitative infinity and quantitative infinity? Didn't you show us that there are two forms of infinity? You showed us that there are these bad forms of infinity, these spurious forms of infinity, where infinity is set off over against the finite. It's the non-finite. That's all we mean by the infinite. It's just that beyond, Jenseits, right? That beyond, that is always out there, whether here now beyond in the sense of greater or beyond in the sense of lesser. But it's just beyond. You told us that there's that, right, we got that. But what about the other form? There's a qualitative infinitizing as a process. There's a quantitative infinitizing, isn't there, again, as a process, that doesn't fall prey to that. It actually has this moment of coming back to itself. That doesn't go to the beyond, but that actually others itself, and by that othering of itself, So the transitioning, the surpassing comes to be itself, completes itself. And Hegel will say, right, I did show you that. So, well, okay, then what's up, my friend, right? There's not measureless here, right? There's not measurelessness here. We've got circularity, don't we? It comes back to itself. And Hegel wants to say, not here, then. I'm sorry, why not? And the why not is a really important question, right? Why doesn't it come back to it? Why, because if it did, we'd be finished with the doctrine of being, and the doctrine of being would not go anywhere. And that's not the answer, right, for why it doesn't. It's just noting if that were possible here, then Hegel would want to say, and we are now done, to be is to be measured. Qualitative and quantitative determinations are complete and full, specifying real measures. They are, in this sense, genuine forms of infinity, and we're good. But Hegel doesn't say that. Why? Not because he wants to make it to essence. That'd be the chief answer, right? That'd be the non-imminent, non-necessary answer. That'd be the, well, you know, we have to go to essence next, right? Because in the history of things, or whatever your account's going to be, we have to move to that next. Hegel's resisting that. It's not what he thinks. What he thinks is that qualitative infinity, which is the alteration of those states, from quality 1 to quality 2 to qualitative state 3, and quantitative infinity, which is the movement along that line, so the nodal line, the line part of the nodal line, that they may be infinitizingly related to themselves. Yeah, quality is related to itself, quantity is related to itself, but that's not the issue now. The issue is, do they set boundaries on one another? And that's where the infinitizing process breaks. That's what's not here. That's what's not working, at least at this moment. That's what's not happening. Why? Because it's all you have is transformation and an abiding substrate underlying them. What's the abiding substrate? The abiding substrate is this. What do you have here? Changing states. So an abiding substrate and changing states. And the problem is, how do they relate to one another? That's the problem now. Is there an infinitizing relationship between the two of them? And Hegel is going to say at this level, in the terms of the doctrine of being, there is not. There is not. So what you have at the end of this is two claims he wants to make. To be is to be measured, to be is to be measured, to be measureless. That gets us to here. But to be measurelessness is to be, as he says at this moment, indifferent. Indifferent. Now that's interesting, right? Because Hegel's taken us a long way from where we started. When we said being pure being, one of the things we said about being pure being was that it was vacuous, empty, indeterminate. You could have also said it was indifferent. And it sounds like we're back there. Oh my God, we've gone all this way, we're 300 whatever pages, and now we're all the way back to the beginning. And Hegel gets this, he understands this completely. He says, you think we're back at the beginning. We are not. Because now there's qualitative determination, quantitative determination, which were not there in pure being. So being is no longer, if you want to put it in those terms, pure any longer. It has specifications that it did not have initially. And yet there is a deeper dimension in which we can say that it measures itself, but it's incapable actually of measuring itself. There's the paradox. It is measured, but it's not up to measuring itself. And that is its indifferent state that it has reached now. Quite a different sense of indifference now. So he'll give it a different name, right? He says it's indifference. That's why he calls it that rather than Gleichgültigkeit. He uses both terms here, right? But he does start to emphasize this is really a different kind of indifference. He's picking up on Schelling's usage of the indifference point, right? The kind of non-differentiation point. He's picking up and saying, this is where you have that. You have qualitative determination, quantitative determination. They should measure one another, but they actually are incapable of doing that in the precise way in which measure demands. It sets boundaries. Okay, so it's measuring, right? Yeah, but it's not setting definitive boundaries. Because every last one of those boundaries is always, whether we're talking up the line or down the line, going to be surpassed. It's going to be measureless in that sense. If you take a look, just stay with me on 323. I'm just going to quote several lines from that page going on down now from where we were just at, over to 324. I just want to pick these out because he makes this point repeatedly in several different formulations. It's incredibly important for him, so it's worth spending a moment here to look at how he expresses it. He says, This is 323. This is 5 lines. 5 lines from the bottom, I think. But this infinite of the specification of measure. Yeah, so 5 lines up from the bottom. But this infinite of the specification of measure posits both the qualitative and the quantitative as each sublating itself into the other. They are what they are. So there's the double transition still going on. They are what they are by virtue of the other. And it thereby posits their first immediate unity, which is measure in general. So he's telling you, the title of this section is the measureless. So how did we get here? We got here by first talking about measure. Then he says, as returned into itself and as consequently as itself posited. Then he says, this unity, no, this is on 324 now, so the next page over. This unity that thus continues itself into itself in its alternating measures is the self-subsistent matter. It is the zaka, he says, it's the issue, it's the fact. That's the way you get it translated. So this is 324, right at the end of the paragraph that comes over on 324. He also calls it here the same. This is the path. This is the next paragraph down. So this is where he introduces his substrate states language. Right. This is where he starts to talk about the measureless in terms of a substrate abiding and the states, the qualitative changes, constantly alternating. He says there, this reciprocal transition or passing over into the other of the qualitative and the quantitative moments occurs on the basis of their unity. So this is the end of the full paragraph on 324 that begins what we have here is alpha. Everybody see where I'm at? Look at the end of that paragraph, that's where he's saying this. This reciprocal transition or passing over into the other, the qualitative and the quantitative moments, occurs on the basis of their unity. And the meaning of this process is only the existence. So he's going back and grabbing that. That's what it is to be, right? That's their Dasein. And that is the demonstration of the positing that such a substrate in German, does underlie the process, and that this substrate is the unity of its moments. And you want to think, oh, he's telling us we've got something that's steady here. Yeah, something that's abiding here. You don't have something that's material in the sense that we have normally thought about material, dead, inert. It's not that, because clearly the abiding substrate is just what? The quantitative continuum. Right? That's all it is. So it's a process. But for now, it's just something that abides. It's something that bears the qualitative states. And then look at what he says about that. This is on 325. This is the paragraph taken over to the top of 325, comes from the bottom of 324. It's the end of that paragraph. The measures in the self-subsistent forms posited, right there at the end of that paragraph on 325. He writes, the measures in the self-subsistent forms posited with them are consequently demoted to states. So qualitative changes are now states, so substrate and states. Alternation is only the mutation of a state, and that which passes over is posited as remaining the same in the mutation or change. That's Hegel echoing language of 300 pages ago, so it's a little hard to remember it. But he told us what? That being passes over into, transitions into nothing, nothing passes over, transitions into being, and they are thereby dasselbe, the same. He's saying this now at the deeper level. Why that happens at that level, we now have an account of. Remember, we're moving back into the ground of those things. So why does being become nothing? Why does nothing become being? They become that because they cannot be what they are except to be the other thing. But now we see underlying them, you could say. It's a bit of a way of presenting it, but I think it makes the point. We're burrowing down into being to find why it does this. Why do we see it flowing? Right? Why is it determined as flowing? Why is it determined as becoming? It is that because its qualitative and quantitative determinations are measureless. They flow into one another. There's a substrate that abides, right, that bears them together and lets that changing take place. But it's constantly alteration going on. So what's driving all that, you could say, why do things come to be and pass away? They do so, Hegel's at least, not ultimate answer, but provisional answer in the doctrine of being, is because, well, actually, what's coming to being and passing away are qualitative states. And what abides is the substrate that bears them. So being, then, we could say at this point, is the unity of qualitativeness and quantitativeness, which is nothing other than measure. To be is to be measured. The interdependent limiting, the setting of boundaries of quality and quantity with respect to one another, it's the nodal line. And this is ultimately being as at once continuity, gradually increasing, decreasing quantity, the substrate, and discrete change, sudden alternating quality changes, states. But if being is at once an unchanging substrate in which the becoming of qualitatively and quantitatively defined states takes place, that's where it happens. Then the coming to being and passing away, the alternation of such states, if that's where that happens, then being is both the same, the substrate, and different than itself, qua the states. Being is therefore as substrate indifferent. This is how he comes to this point, right? It's indifferent to its changes. It bears them, but is not changed by them. Sure, they're going on. I'll caricature this a little bit, right? Sure, it's going on, but doesn't really take notice of it. Right? The substrate it's not bothered by it. Right? If you want to personify this, right? The substrate is indifferent to, it's not determined by, it's not differentiated by the qualitative, because it persists. It persists. It's the pure continuity that bears the differentiating states within it. So it's indifferent to them. And that allows Hegel to conclude, which is momentous for him. He thinks this is really ultimately what you get in the doctrine of being, that being is indifferent to its own determinations. Being is ultimately indifferent. That's what this shows. Being is ultimately indifferent to its own determinations. So the measurelessness of being is its indifference to its own changing. Right? To be measureless means the changes don't matter. Being is not determined by its own alternating phase shifts from one qualitative state to another. It doesn't matter to it. So being in the structure of substrates and states has come to be equivalent to itself. It is gleichgültig, it's the same as itself. But this is just to say that being is indifferent to its very own determinacies, indifference. He says this on 326. Being is indifference, he says, right at the very, he calls it abstract indifference, right at the top of page 326. So qualitative infinity and quantitative infinity are thus caught up in the never-ending cycle, the ever-ending movement of the measureless, a substrate indifferent to its ever-changing states. So far, so good. Now, one of the things I love but also hate about Hegel is that he's willing to take this as far as he needs to, because he thinks we've got to follow out the determinations where they take us. And this, makes him brilliant in one sense. He's just willing to go, where does this stuff go? Where does it take us? I'll not slap on an answer. I'll not save this dilemma. I'll not solve this paradox because it needs to be solved in some kind of way. I'm just going to let it go where it goes. And this is where it takes us. It takes us to being is absolute indifference. But then he wants to say, and yet that indifference is itself a contradiction. In fact, it's in contradiction with itself. He says this explicitly on 330. So take a look over on 330. He says, this is the first full paragraph down on 330. The first full paragraph begins, this unity, 330. He writes, this unity, he's talking about the unity between the substrate and the states, right? This unity, thus posited as the totality of the process of determining, because that's everything. That's qualitative determination, quantitative determination, everything that's going on. To be is to be measured, to be measured is to be measureless. That unity now, it's self-determined in this process as indifference is a contradiction all around. How? You just told us it's a difference that makes no difference. That's basically the definition of indifference. It has differentiation, qualitative changes going on, but it literally makes no difference to being itself. It doesn't define being. It doesn't have any intrinsic determination of being. Why would it be a contradiction? He ups the ante. Look what he says here. It must therefore be posited as this self-sublating contradiction. Now it's in contradiction with itself, whatever that's going to mean. And then it's a contradiction that actually cancels but yet preserves itself. Self-sublating. Notice, essence doesn't sublate being. No essence here yet. We'll get there. But essence doesn't come in to save being from itself. It emerges endemically out of being's own contradiction. It's immanent to being itself. He says this, it must therefore be posited. He's talking here in the sense of made explicit. Remember, posited had those two senses? Positive means both setting, means always setting something out. But you can set something out as to render something explicit that's merely implicit. That's the sense in which he's clearly using it here. We need to now make it explicit. What's implicit, there's a contradiction here that's covered over by this indifference, and yet is there. We need to pay attention to that. That's what he's about to do. But that's going to demand that we move someplace else. The other sense of positing, which he's about to use as well, not in this passage, but in the passage that are about to come at the end of the section on being, is positing. Zetsen means not only to place out in the sense, to put before us, not in the sense of rendering something explicit, but also to produce something. To produce something. To zets is to produce something, to place it out there before. So here he says, it must therefore be posited, here made explicit, as what? As this self-sublating contradiction. Well, you ought to be saying at that point, I have no clue what he's talking about. Here's the maddening side of Hegel, right? He's claiming something and you think, oh, were we supposed to get that at some point already? No is the answer. No. This is Hegel asserting something and then saying, we've got to actually show it. I owe you an account of that. So he says, it be determined as subsistence existing for itself, one which no longer has a merely indifferent unity for a result. Now that ought to key you off. One has no longer this indifference that we've just been talking about. It's not that. It is that, but it's not that ultimately. Okay? So we haven't been shown that yet. So how are we going to be shown this? Well, he clues you into where this is going to happen. He says, as subsistence existing for itself, one which no longer has a merely indifferent unity for result, but a unity eminently negative and absolute. A unity eminently negative and absolute. Okay, what kind of negativity is that? Well, he gives you the name for it. This is essence. And you really ought to repel at that. You ought to look at that and go, sorry. Okay. I've been reading philosophy for a few years now, right? And the way we define essence is not, I don't know what it is, but it's certainly not that. Yeah. Right? Nobody, literally no one in the history of philosophy says, oh, what you need to do is show that being has a self-sublating contradiction built into it that's absolute negativity, and then, that's essence. No, nobody says that. Right? And yet Hegel thinks this is the imminent and necessary entailment of what being itself is. That's why you're entitled to speak of essence. This is his point, right? We talk about essence all the time, as though we were entitled to the concept. But we're not entitled to any concept as far as Hegel's concerned, that we haven't shown its bona fides, that we haven't shown its quid juris, that we haven't answered the question, by what right do we have that concept? And that's what this entire project is, to demonstrate that we have a lot of concepts, but the ones that we're entitled to are the ones that actually flow imminently and necessarily from the concept of being itself. So if we're going to use the concept of essence, we can't presuppose it, we can't presuppose what it is, and we can't presuppose that it's somewhere else to be brought in to save the day, which is, sorry for those of you who are fans of this, the Platonic way of doing this, right? Because as Plato tells us in the Meno, Socrates tells us in the Meno, what is the purpose of knowledge? Knowledge is to tether all things down, to give them a ground. Hegel's saying, well, we'll get there. There's a ground to be had here, but we got to show that we're entitled to that claim. So we can't just assert essences. We've got to show that they flow necessarily from being itself. And that's all hinged on this, whatever it means, that being is a self-sublating contradiction. All right. That's the setup for the third claim. To be is to be measureless is to be essence. That means the truth of being is essence. Make a little bit of sense? Now remember what he says here on 330, because it's helpful. He gives you a clue here. He gives you really two clues. The one we're going to focus on is this one. He says, there's a contradiction at work here in this indifference of being, and we've got to render it explicit. So there's your first clue. Whatever he's going to do from here on, he's got to address that. He's got to show that there's some kind of contradiction that's not at issue right now. Indifference is what's at issue right now, but buried within indifference is, imminent within indifference is a contradiction nonetheless. So the first thing you want to ask is, okay, how do we make, where do we make, what is the making explicit of that contradiction? First order of business. And then he says, and this is more tentative, right? Let me give you that, because we'll still be mystified by it when we get on the pages where he actually does this. But he says, it must therefore be posited and made explicit as this self-sublating contradiction and be determined as subsistence existing for itself. Subsistence is another way of talking about the substrate, right? So it exists for itself. One which no longer has a merely indifferent unity for result. That's where we're at right now. So it's no longer going to have that indifferent unity. So if we make it explicit, then the substrate won't be indifferent to the alterations of its states. It won't just bear them. Because that's what it means for it to be indifferent. It holds them, bears them, supports them, whatever your favorite term for that is, contains them. He says, but that's all in a different relationship. He says, but one which no longer has a merely indifferent unity for result, but one which he's still talking about subsistence, a unity eminently negative and absolute. Eminently negative and absolute. We don't know what that means right now, and we're still going to be struggling at the end of being to really figure out what that means. But he is going to say that the substrate doesn't just bear its alterations, it generates them. It generates them. I'm putting language in, I'm putting terms in formulations that he doesn't exactly put it that way, but he'll use the language of three terms he'll use for generating or producing. Positing, reflection, and relativity. Those are the three terms he's going to say we don't yet have on the table, we haven't yet seen, but it's here. But that means that we're no longer talking about how being determines itself. We're talking about how being is determined by its own mediation of itself. And that's no longer being. That is essence. He literally defines essence as being mediating itself. Being mediating itself. That's like the minimal definition of essence. Make a little bit of sense, at least the setup? All right, then let's take a look at 334 and 335. Because this is where if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. And I want to go through these couple pages. I talked through them a little bit last time. I'm going to go back through them fairly carefully and slowly. I've got a step-by-step layout of the argument. So let me put that up here so you can reference that as we go through. I wish I could make it bigger, but I'd like to have the whole thing up there so we can track our way through it. I'll try to point our way as we go through this. But just remember from that passage, right? If you're reading Hegel, it's always good to say, okay, he said a couple things there that were tantalizing, kind of promissory notes. One was about making something explicit. So now you ought to be on the lookout for, okay, what is he making explicit? Where does that happen? And then the second thing he said was that the substrate would be some kind of negativity at some point. Like the subsistence, the substrate would be some kind of negativity at some point. So where does that? Those are in that sense, the road marks you want to hold on to and see when they happen. So I submit that they happen on 334 and 335. Let's look at what he does there. So given that the relationship between qualitative infinity, that is the states, and quantitative infinity, the substrate, has now proven to be the very core of what being is, then the whole movement of being itself, the spurious infinity of the measureless, which is the whole of being as such, actually stands in contradiction with itself. Now, it's indifferent to itself, yes, but it actually, he's going to claim, stands in contradiction to itself. And as a result, being, in the end, is incapable of determining itself by virtue of the constitutive movement that is endemic to it. It can't actually account for itself, and it can't actually be itself. It can't determine itself. Well, what's the contradiction that's embedded within being that now has to be made explicit? Well, on 334, he begins to explain this. So take a look on 334, this is 382 in the German. The first full paragraph down, it begins, but this self-sublation. Everybody see where I'm at? Go to the second sentence in that paragraph. The first sentence is wonderful, but go to the second sentence in that paragraph. He writes this. Indifference is in itself the totality in which all the determinations of being are sublated and contained. All right, we've been here. Can we make an advance at all? I mean, you keep telling us this. But this is standard Hegel, right? He always likes to remind you, here's where we've gotten. No further. But here's where we got. It's important. Here's what we got. Then he says, thus it is the substrate. Well, you know, the Grundlage is the term he uses for it here. Substrate is the term he used earlier. I think it's sufficient to, it's okay to translate both terms the same. He's talking about the same thing. Then he says, so that's where we already been. He says, but at first, and whenever Hegel says something's at first, initially, zunach, whenever he says something is immediately like this, you want to listen up because he's about to tell you it's not going to remain that way. But at first, only in the one-sided, again, whenever he says one-sided, you ought to prick up your ears, right? He's telling you it's not going to remain that. In the one-sided determination of being in itself. So the substrate is just unto itself. It's self-standing. And consequently, the differences, what's the differences? The states. So the substrate's being in itself. The states, differences, the quantitative difference and the inverse ratio of proportion are present in it as what? External. Yeah, it has them, but you know, it's not intrinsic to it. The substrate bears them, contains them. But then look at what he says about it. Next sentence. As thus the contradiction. Now, a few pages ago, this was an indifferent condition. Exactly, we're not talking about something new, we're talking about the exact same thing. He's just saying substrate bore the states, and then it's indifferent to it. And now we want to notice, hey, it's being in itself, but its differences are actually extraneously other than it. And so it's in contradiction to itself somehow. Look at how he says, what he says about it. As thus the contradiction of itself and its determinateness. It is itself, but it's not itself, because what is itself? The substrate just is its qualitative states. That's what he's pointing out. That's what he's rendering explicit. That the substrate doesn't have a being in itself except for its determination as qualitative alteration. Doesn't have anything else. That's all it is. So you can say it's indifferent, but it's really not. It is itself and it is not itself. There's contradiction. That's what he means by it. It is itself and it is not itself at the same time. It is, the substrate is itself. It's the bearer of those qualitative changes, but it's also not itself because its qualitative changes look like it's extrinsic to it. And yet, they're necessary for it to be what it is. It's thus the contradiction of itself and its determinateness, of its implicitly, it's in itself, here's what needs to be rendered explicit, implicitly existent determination and of its posited determinateness. So it's within itself, it's being in itself, the substrate, and then it has all these determinations that it bears. It, he's still talking about the substrate, is what? The negative totality. Now, I don't know about your ears. To my ears, I've been reading Hegel a long time, but still, when you first read negative totality, you think, that's bad. It's negative. It's a negative totality. So that's got to be a bad thing. No. Here's what he says. It is the negative totality whose determinacies have internally sublated themselves. Internally sublate themselves. They cancel themselves but preserve themselves. Yet the states are what they are. The substrate is what it is by virtue of the states being what they are. So this running on of the measurelessness of the qualitative and the running on of the measurelessness of the quantitative actually does have a determination of one another. He says, consequently have also sublated the one-sidedness of their substrate, their in-itselfness. So the substrate is not indifferent. One-sidedness in itselfness is all code words for its indifferent condition. So it's not that. Indifference now posited is what what in fact is simple and infinitely negative self-relation. You have reference. The same. It's negative self-relation. The incompatibility of itself with itself. He goes back and grabs this from the end of the quality because he still loves this term. The repelling of itself from itself. It others itself. That's this substrate that looked like it was a dead thing. That was the bearer, the container, the site where these transformations were happening. That's the indifference of it, but it proves out that it's actually not that because the substrate can't be indifferent and be itself. For the substrate to be itself is dependent on the states, the qualitative change of the states. Those qualitative changing states are products of, this is what he means by negative self-relation. It negates itself, the substrate negates itself, others itself, and thereby becomes itself now in the changing of the states. You're gonna say, oh, okay. If you stopped at that moment, you would say, okay, we've been here before. Just like with qualitative infinity, just like with quantitative infinity, we've got now here the answer to measurelessness, right? Measurelessness is the name for spurious bad quantitative infinity. That's what that is. And now we've got the infinitizing, right? Now we've got the process where the two relata are not just interdependent on one another, mutually reciprocally determining, but they actually are produced by this process that generates them both. And that process is the name of that's the negative self-relation. And okay, calm down, being is that. And Hegel wants to say, that's right. But that's no longer being. Because we've exhausted being. This is something other than being. It has to be named that. Why? Because it's not qualitative work, it's not quantitative work. It's not the setting of the measure of one upon the other anymore. This is the substrate doing the work of producing the qualitative changing states. He says, is simple and infinitely negative self-relation, the incompatibility of itself with itself, the repelling of itself from itself. Determining and being determined are not a transition, nor an external alteration. He's literally going back to the very beginning of the doctrine of being. It's not a transition, it's not alteration like you saw in quality, nor again an emergence of determinations in it, but its own relating to itself, which is the negativity of itself, of its in itselfness. It's in itselfness. The substrate's in itselfness. It is itself only by becoming other than itself. Not at all by being indifferent to itself. And now we've rendered this contradiction that to be itself, it has to be other than itself. It's true of the substrate. We've now rendered that which was implicit, explicit. Well, what follows from that? Look in the next paragraph. But as so repelled, this is typical Hegel. He's saying, as I just showed you, right, as so repelled, if the substrate just is nothing other than this negative positing, this othering of itself in order to be the state, the determinations are not self-possessed. The states don't remain intrinsic to themselves. He's now flipped back over and saying, let's talk about the state side of this. We were talking about this, the substrate is in itself. It can't be in itself. It's got to be othering of itself. The substrate, the states, the qualitative states, can't be on their own either. Are not self-possessed, do not emerge as self-subsistent or external, but are rather as moments. So here's moments as a technical term. They are moments of what? Moments of a process. What's the process of the substrate othering itself? This negative self-relation. So he says, first, as belonging to the unity whose existence is still only implicit, they are not let go by it, but are rather borne by it. So he's just reminding you, right? The states are held on by the substrate. So that's one sense in which they're not let go by it, right? It's borne by it. But he says, and second, as determination is immanent to the unity as it exists for itself, they are only through their repulsion from themselves. Instead of some existent or other as they are in the whole sphere of being, they now are simply and solely as posited. Now, here's where you ought to hear posited in both the senses. Now we've had this contradiction made explicit, a contradiction that's in the substrate. It can't be itself unless it others itself. It's also a contradiction in the states. They can't be themselves unless they are borne by and tethered by back to something that is more fundamental than them. So we've got a contradiction on both sides. But that means then that the states are only as positive, that is, as products, as produced. He then says, with the sole determination and significance or meaning of being related, you have referred, related to their unity, the substrate, and hence each to the other, so they bear relationship to one another because they bear relationship to the substrate that underlies them, and to negation, marked by this their relativity. So Hegel's term here is not, this is a measuring relationship. It's come out of the measuring relationship, but the failure, ultimately, of the measuring relationship to be able to measure. Being can't measure itself on its own terms. Its own determinations can't measure itself. And yet, endemic to it is precisely this contradiction of substrate and states. And it is substrate, it is the states by virtue of the substrate generating the states. That's their relativity relationship to one another. So if you want to put it in very basic terms, the quantitative continuum, which is the substrate, is related to the qualitative changes, which are the states, through what he calls this notion of relativity, or positing, or as he's about to call it, he already has called it that, reflection. So whenever you hear the word reflection in Hegel, you ought to think of this first, not the mental operation we do. He's about to tell you and warn you about that. He's picked a term he knows has a clear association with mentality. Right? Reflection is something we do when we see something, we reflect upon it. He's well aware of that, he understands that, he's used it himself that way many, many, many times. But he also thinks the ontological process of it is here. Before it's mental, it's this. Then the summary passage up on the top of 335. And this is Hegel sort of now backing off. He thinks he's done the proof at that point. He's demonstrated what he needed to demonstrate. You may find him lacking, okay? You may find that wanting, but at least he's tried to do two things, made explicit this contradiction that was not explicit in difference, and then by virtue of showing that, show that the contradiction actually points us to the way of understanding substrate as generative of the states themselves. But then the substrate can't just be another determination of being. Here's what he says. Top of 335, 382 in the German. Being in general and the being or immediacy of the different determinacies have thereby vanished just as much as the in itself has, and the unity is being. So there's his sort of summary claim about the nature of being. And all the determinacies have collapsed into this unity that we've now gotten between the substrate and the states. He then says, and the unity is being immediately presupposes totality, so that it is only this simple self-relation. If you stop there, you would say, okay, being is hermetic. Being is completely closed in upon itself. But look at what he does say about it. Mediated by the sublation of this presupposition. It's mediated by this. It's actually got mediation built into its immediacy. This isn't hermetically sealed being. Being is mediating of itself and thereby othering of itself. And this presupposedness, the immediate being, is itself only a moment of its repelling. It's becoming other than itself. Colon. The original subsistence and self-identity are only as the resulting infinite self you have rejoining coming back to itself. Zusammengang, right? Comes back to itself. And so is being determined as essence. Now, I know it says more, we'll come to that more in just a second, because that's a summation of what he says about the doctrine of being, but you ought to back off at that point and go, what is he claiming essence is? I mean, I know what the tradition has said essence is. Right? We all know that the essence is that which makes something what it is. Okay? It's roughly the definition out of the metaphysics and Aristotle. That which makes something what it is. The what it isness of something. This is that but not that. Right? If you think about it for a moment, what is it to be? Well, it's to be qualitatively and quantitatively determined, to be a nodal line. Right? And you want to say, well, what makes something what it is as the nodal line? What makes it, what constitutes the nodal line is a process. And that process is what? The substrate generating the states. The substrate positing the states, and thereby relating them to one another, relating them to itself, the relativity. So the negative self-relation. So the substrate is not just another determination of being, because it's generative. It has a kind of priority. It's generative of the changing, the alternating states. So it's actually doing the work of producing the nodal line itself. So it is the what it is to be a being. It is the essence. So you can, if you think through the classical traditional definition of what it is to be, right, the traditional definition of essence, you get to what he's talking about. But you don't normally think of it this way, because we think of it, oh, it's a set of attributes, a set of properties that something has that makes it, the essence of a table is to be for, all the functional definitions, whatever. And Hegel wants to say, right, I know that. Right? I read the history, I understand that. But underlying that, undergirding that, has got to be something that's explanatory of our ascriptions we make historically. The concept has to be one. It has to be shown, W-O-N, not O-N-E. And so it has to be demonstrated. Well, here's the demonstration. The substrate is what generates the states. But then what does that mean? He says this. And so is being determined as essence. Notice, being is determined as essence. Not essence came to save being from its paradoxical state of condition. Oh my God, being was indifferent. Thank God that essence showed up to save it from its disastrous condition. No, it's not at all what Hegel's saying. He's saying being has shown itself imminently necessarily to not just be being, but to be necessarily essence. So being is determined as essence. He means that full stop. So we haven't left being when we enter the domain of essence. It's not this strange two-world theory, right? And there are two dimensions. We're going to talk about that at the beginning of essence, right? That's what the essential and the unessential is about. That's what shine versus essence. All those kinds of things will be there. But that's two dimensions, one world. Two strata, one world. Two dimensions, one world, not two worlds. So essence is a determination of being. What is that determination of being? He defines it for you. Being which through the sublation of being is simple being with itself. Now, no metaphysics textbook will get by with that definition, right? What is an essence? Oh, that's simple. It's being that sublates itself. And thereby is with itself in and through its otherness. But that's what he's saying, literally what he's saying. So the minimal definition of essence is being that now others itself and comes to be itself in this othering of itself. And when it does that, it's not just being anymore. It is being, but it's transformed itself into another dimension of itself, namely essence. And that's why he says it's simple being with itself. Well, not so simple. It took 300 pages to get us to that claim. But it is simple in the sense of being is able to be itself. It's able to be a changing set of qualitative states, because it's borne by, tethered to, and ultimately produced by a substrate that is its essence, that is being as well. So, walk you through here. First, I'm walking back through the passages we've been through. This is literally what this is trying to capture in step-by-step form. So first at this stage, the qualitative determinacies of states are not simply there, existing on their own as changing states. The qualitative states have shown themselves to be dependent on the persisting substrate, Grundlage as he puts it here, that at least in the final stage of being bears them. So the final stage, indifferent stage, right, bears them. So the states are determinacies that are held together and thus belong to it. The substrate is a negative totality. The qualitative states are moments belonging to the implicit unity. They're not expelled from it, but are borne by it as a substrate and filled solely by it. Secondly, then, so that's the first claim he wants to make. So that's indifference. Right? Nothing terribly radically new about that. Second one and third one is really where the work gets done. Secondly, most fundamentally, the same substrate thus that bears the qualitative states is itself a process. That's what he's been showing us in this last few pages. It is a movement of positing, Zetson, by which both the qualitative and the quantitative are what they are. To be positive means in this context to have something's dependence on something else made explicit. Its dependence means it's been produced by it. To be positive means, here the dependence of qualitative determinacy, qualitative infinity, on the enduring identity of the substrate, quantitative infinity, that bears them both means that both the qualitative and the quantitative are only as constituted by it. The substrate as a negative self-relation, a repelling of itself from itself. He says, as determinations that are immanent in the explicated unity, they, the qualitative states, are only through their repulsion from themselves. They are what they are by virtue of not being the next qualitative state. That's because they're being produced by something that's other than both. Thirdly, it follows then that the passing over of quality into quantity, of quantity back into quality, is rooted more fundamentally in a deeper process, the process that is the substrate itself. This is the thing to get. When he says substrate, he doesn't mean a thing. He doesn't mean dead matter. He means a process. The process that is the substrate itself, whereby both strata, the changing states of quality and the enduring quantitative identity of the substrate, are held together and yet distinct as moments of a relational whole, what he calls the negative totality. Fourthly, then, this more fundamental generative movement is designated as relativity or reflection, the mediating substrate, what he'll call the depth, whereby the immediate state or surface, as we'll call them in the doctrine of essence, is what it is. Instead of some existent or other, as they are in the whole sphere of being, they, the qualitative determinations, now are simply and solely as posited with the sole determination and significance of being related to their unity, substrate, and hence to each other and to negation, marked by their relativity. The conclusion he wants to draw from that is the state-substrate relationship, thus proves itself to be that between being and essence. Essence, we can say then, to take up this language, measures. It's the only thing that can measure being. Being can't measure itself. Essence can measure being, but essence is another determination of being. It's what being is, insofar as it measures itself. Here's that final paragraph again. Being in general and the being or immediacy of the differentiated determinacies have thereby vanished just as much as the in itself-ness, and the unity is being immediately presupposes totality, so that it is only this simple self-relation, mediated by the sublation of this presupposition and this presupposedness. The immediate being is itself only a moment of its repelling. So the states are there only as a virtue of the repelling itself. The original self-subsistence and self-identity are only as a resulting infinite self-rejoining, coming back to itself with itself. And so is being thus determined as essence, being that through the sublation of being, the simple being with itself. Or as he puts it much more succinctly on 389, 241 in the German, the truth of being is essence. Being is shine. Essence is reflection. What follows from that? There's how you start the doctrine of essence. That make a little bit of sense? So the key move here is to think, what's the substrate? So the nodal line thing, right? Everything is a nodal line. That means everything has a substrate state structure. Literally, that's the nature of being for everything. And that substrate state structure falls into this analysis, right? It looks initially like it's indifferent, as though the substrate just bears the qualitative states changing. But at the end of the day, what does it prove out to be the case? That the substrate generates the states and they're changing. When it generates them, then the relationship is no longer one of indifference, it's no longer one simply of being. Being has determined itself as essence at that point, because the substrate measures the states. Make some sense? Now, I don't want to get lost in this, right? I'm sure you might have questions about this. But this analysis perplexed the hell out of Hegel, right? Himself. How do we know that? Well, I would submit we know it because of this. What you have, we just worked through, was the 1831 version of this, right? The 1831 version of him going back and revising things in the doctrine of being. And I didn't want to make a lot about those changes in many of the other passages, because some of them are fairly incidental, some are just emphasizing things, but some of them are fairly significant and important. Here's one. Here's one. So if you look in on the D2L side, I have in parallel for you the German of the ending section, right, the emergence of essence, from the 1812 edition, the original edition of the Science of Logic, and a parallel English translation. I'm only going to focus on the last literal paragraph there to show you what he says. In 1812, this is on D2L as well, this is comparison. He says, this is all he says. This is how the transition is done in 1812, from being to essence. Being as self is simply recollected being is essence. Recollected being, that sounds like memory, like I'm doing something. It's a mental operation, something I do. This is interiorization is oftentimes how Hegel thinks about this. When you remember in this way, when you recollect in this way, you interiorize in some way. It sounds like it's completely mental operations doing the work. Look what he says. The truth of being is to be immediate as absolute sublated immediacy. Absolute sublated immediacy. Okay. We kind of know, having gone through the later account, what sublated immediacy can kind of mean, but here he's just stating it. It is only as negative relation. Again, we can kind of make sense of that. Thus, it repels itself from itself. This repelling is its non-being. So it is at first immediacy, qualitative being. But this non-being is indifference to itself. Here we can kind of track this a little bit. We've already seen this argument he's been making before. The sublation of itself, so at first it is quantitative being. So it's just the substrate, as we would call it. This is already in itself, the return into itself. Insofar as it is this, it is first determined as non-being, but it is quantitative being only insofar as that first immediate being is. Quantitative being makes itself into measure, and as that into indifference being for itself is determined precisely as this: the immediate being as a non-being and being in itself as determinants. Being in that it is not to be what it is and to be what it is not, as this simple negativity of itself is essence. In 1812, that's how the transition is made. Now, what he's saying there, for all the technical jargon that goes on here, he's built up to this, but it's this quick, is just to say being is inherently negative with respect to itself. It others itself. And because it mediates or others itself, it's essence. That's it. That's the whole account. 5 years later in the encyclopedia, he's grappling with this same problem. Look at how he does it there. What is actually posited therein? He's talking about in the measureless. Right? That's the paragraph just before, so he's referencing that back. Is that the transition in general sublates itself. Here's that moment again where it takes it up and cancels itself. It mediates itself, it others itself, and thereby comes to be itself. Since the qualitative and the quantitative are themselves qualitatively different or diverse, but the quality sublates itself in the indifferent determinacy of the quantum just as much as it's posited in it, and in this its externalization only comes together with itself. So the qualitative and the quantitative pass over into one another. So the negativity is posited to sublate itself in its otherness just as much as it is positive to sublate this otherness. Being that relates itself to itself in this way, this internal self-sublating, is essence. So he really hasn't advanced much in the account from 1812 to 1817. 10 years later, he's changing it again. Now, what's interesting about this is whenever Hegel's bothered by something, you can tell it because he goes back and changes it. And initially, he'll make small changes sometimes. He'll just say, I'm working on, I need to figure this out. And so that's what you see him doing here. He's basically got the same analysis. He hasn't really changed his analysis. Notice, there's nothing in those first two ways of talking about this in terms of substrate and state. They're nowhere to be found. They're missing completely. In the first one, the 1812 edition, there's something called an independent, some self-standing. That's kind of like what the substrate is, but he doesn't really explore it in any kind of detail. So in 1817, he's still talking about how it mediates, being mediates itself, and by mediating itself, it is essence. In 1827, it's pretty clear, this is 10 years now from 1817, right? He's coming, and he repeats this in 1830. So he keeps this all the way through to 1830. He's 1 year, from doing the revisions that we've seen. So here's his analysis. It's obviously been expanded, but it's still basically the same analysis. The infinite, the affirmation as a negation, now has for its sides quality and quantity. The nodal line, it's got both sides. And quantity, instead of the more abstract sides of being and nothing, something, another, and so on. So we refined this, right? We moved all through the doctrine being now to this. Those sides of the infinite have made the transition alpha first of quality into quantity. He gives you the paragraph number where he showed that, so he's going back and saying, look, I showed you how quality transforms into quantity. And then of quantity into quality, paragraph 105, so the two sides are passing into one another, and been demonstrated by this means to be negations. So he wants to now say, I know this up here doesn't work terribly well, this up here is not working terribly well. Let me slow you down in the analysis and show how this actually develops. So here's the first stage of the argument. Second stage, but in their unity, measure. So he's giving you back the whole of the logic of being again. They are at first distinct, and one is only by being mediated by the other. The states, we would say in our language, the language he gives us in 1831, is mediated by the substrate. It's borne by it, contained in it. And gamma, after the immediacy of this unity has been proved to be self-sublating, there's that key moment. Right? It's not just borne by it, but it sublates it in some way. This unity is now posited as what it is in itself, as simple relation to itself that contains being in general, and its sublated forms within itself. It contains them within itself. He thinks he's done now. Being, or the immediacy that is mediation with itself and the relation to itself through the negation of itself, and thus equally mediation that sublates itself towards relation to itself, that is towards immediacy, is essence. And then we get this in 1831. Well, what that tells me, right, the thing we just worked through, what that tells me is that Hegel thinks this transition is incredibly difficult. And he doesn't think any of that actually is satisfactory. He knows how to repeat himself, right? He knows how to say, yeah, that's got it. I need to refine it a little bit. It's not what he does here. He takes all this, I'm being dramatic, chunks it, and says this last section doesn't work. I need to fully and completely replace it. What does he introduce? The key analysis is the substrate in its states. Nowhere to be found in 1812, not introduced in 1817, 1827, 1830, nowhere to be found in any of that. It's only in the last year, literally, of his life that he thinks he has, and we can figure out whether we think he's successful or not. But that's where he's trying to do. He's still, when he told us at the beginning of the book, he says, don't think I've got this perfected. I don't. Well, you can see him in 1831, still trying to get this transition correct, trying to work it out fully and completely, and show how being mediates itself and is thereby essence. Now that he says all the way through, let's be clear. There's the basic claim, the basic thesis about what is essence. Essence is mediated being that mediates itself, that sublates itself. That's true throughout all of the accounts. So I'm not saying there's some dramatic change of doctrine here. There's not a dramatic change of doctrine, but there is a honing and a development, a flourishing, some may think a mystifying, of the argument that he's trying to make that transition make sense, to work out that transition in its details. So I do think he's saying here that essence is being itself, right? So it's not something, he never changes about this. This is always true. Essence is being itself just as far as being has negated itself. That's his message all the way through. Right? So if you want to hold on to a kind of kernel that abides throughout all these claims, that's certainly one. I'll try to identify more as what these are, but that's certainly a claim. It's sublated itself, it's mediated itself, and thereby, because it sublates and mediates itself, it has shed or canceled the vacuous indifferent immediacy to nothing with which it began. Essence is sublated immediacy. And it's immediacy that sublates, it's self-sublating immediacy, if you want to be more precise about it. Essence is thus being itself, but it is being itself no longer as being, in the sense of vacuous nothing, or qualitative reality, quantitative discreteness. Rather, essence is what being finally proves itself imminently and necessarily to be. Essence is thus minimally, here's the basic way Hegel wants to start off talking about essence. Non-immediacy, negativity, relativity, mediation. That's all it is. So that's why all that beginning stuff in the doctrine of being is the doctrine of essence is so crazy. Because he's talking about essence in relationship to being, shine, but he doesn't seem to have our standard conception of essence at play. He doesn't, because all essence means at this point is the non-immediacy, the negativity, the relativity that mediates being. That's all it is. Literally all it is. The rest of it has to be defined, it has to be unpacked. Being in relation to essence is therefore, again, minimally an illusory guise of shine, the German shine. Illusion is one way of translating shine. Guise is the way that Dahlstrom and Brinkman translate shine in the Encyclopedia Logic, the Cambridge edition of the Encyclopedia Logic. Here you have it translated just as shine, S-H-I-N-E in English. I like this guise thing a little bit, because it at least gets the illusory dimension of this there. The shine doesn't quite get that sometimes. But there can be moments where it's quite clear that what Hegel's talking about is that the essence shines in being, right? It displays itself, expresses itself in being. So shine, S-H-I-N-E, makes a lot of sense to use at this point. So an illusory guise or shine, that essence itself projects or posits. The name of that positing is reflection. Make a little bit of sense? Yeah, she's there.
I was just curious, is this like does Hegel struggle with like all transitions, or is this like a particular one you think he's especially struggling with?
We don't know. I'll try to show you when he does the transition from essence to concept. We have what he does in the version we have here, because from now on, right, we don't have any more revisions from Hegel of this text. Right? He dies before he completes revisions. This is as far as he got. So in the Science of Logic, this text, this is his last revisions he made for this text. So when we go into the doctrine of essence, he didn't touch the doctrine of essence for revisions because he didn't get to them, right? We don't know what he would have done if he would have done anything with those. So we'll have the original there. We'll have the 1813 edition of the Doctrine of Essence to look at. But then we can compare it with the 1817 Encyclopedia, 1827, 30 editions of the Encyclopedia, and see how they compare. And I'll do that when we get there. Those major transitions, I think, are important like that. And yeah, we'll deal with those when we get there.
But like like even these three seem very different. Does he have those for the other transitions, and not just in the science of logic, but also like between the different, like the three parts of the broader system, like the logic to nature, nature to spirit? Does he have a lot of extreme revisions in those too, or?
So I'm not going to say he has it for every transition or even the major transitions, that he has this kind of struggle going on. But what I do think is important is that Hegel thought that the fundamental doctrines of the system that he's propounding here are true, right, and correct. He didn't think he was up to the task always of giving a full, complete account of the demonstration. And so you see him struggling with those. And you see him over the course of his career. Right? The system is always being worked upon by him. And that's what the different editions of, well, the Science of Logic, the first, and then the encyclopedia editions of the Science of Logic, you can see him struggling with these things. And I think that's evidence of someone, a thinker, trying to think. And we have documentary evidence of him doing the thinking, because he produced a volume in 1817, he produced it again in 27 with revisions, and again in 30. Sometimes 27 and 30 are like this. He doesn't really change much. Right? So by 1827, he's settled on what he wants to do. So that's pretty clear here, that he's settled on this account. But then in 1831, he changed it to this, right, to what we've seen. So there's a lot goes on that he thinks needs to happen that's not satisfactorily accounted for by this. This is the outlines of the argument he eventually gives. He just doesn't have the substrate states relationship. That's what he doesn't have. That's what he's talking about negations here. That's really what that is, right? That's the beginning of that. But sometimes there'll be massive changes between 27 and 30. This is not one of those cases, but he will do those kinds of changes. So that's him in the process of thinking.
Just final
Yeah,
question.
please.
So, you always kind of like to talk about it, him as like, oh, he's doing this step to the next step to the next step, but he seems like he's got like the step sometimes like already set, and then he's trying to find the connection between the two distinct steps.
Yeah.
Like, is that how the method is in itself, that we, like the finding the connection is separate from knowing what the steps are? Or does that make sense?
I mean, I think he became convinced that if you unpack, if you let being unfold of itself, that what it will entail is qualitative determination, quantitative determinations measure, and that will prove out to be measureless. And he thinks if you follow the measurelessness out, then you will see that initially it determines itself as being purely indifferent, but that indifference proves itself to have mediation built into it. He thinks that's right, and that mediation of being of itself is what essence is. So that line of analysis and that conclusion he's reached, he thinks is right. What he thinks he needs to refine is the argument of that last moment, the last transition from measurelessness to essence. And that's what I see him working on here, trying to, because like I said, the basic line doesn't change of where are we headed. But the steps whereby we're able to show that that's what's necessitated are unpacked in much more detail in 1831 over against what's done in 1812, where he basically says being negates itself and thereby mediates itself and thereby is essence. And you want to say, sorry, how'd that happen? Quality changed into quantity, quantity changed into quality. I got that, but how does that entail something from there that's not just simply within the domain of being? Why does that take us to a different determination of being itself, a fundamentally different determination? That's the argument he's got to make and make better. That's what he thinks he's clearly unsatisfied with his own earlier account of it, that it doesn't do that satisfactorily. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what, maybe I missed it, but what exactly do you think was the unsatisfying part, and how is it solved, and what's maybe at stake?
So it's one thing to say that being mediates itself because it's measureless. I think that's the thesis he holds throughout, from 1812 all the way to 1831. Being mediates itself because it's measureless. But what does that really mean concretely? How does it mediate itself? How does it negate itself and thereby come to be itself? What in the world could that possibly mean, given what measurelessness is? And these all assert that claim. They unpack it in a little more detail. That's what you see in 1827, 1830. He's unpacking it now at this level and this level. He's starting, in 1827, 1830, he's starting to get the argument he's laying out here. But he doesn't have the apparatus to make that argument in 1827, 1830, because he hasn't analyzed it in terms of substrate and states. So that's what he goes to. That's the innovation of 1831. I'm not saying it solves all problems. I'm just saying in 1831, that's the apparatus he goes to, the logical apparatus framework he's using to try to make sense of that. In what sense does it mediate itself? Well, it mediates itself because it's a substrate that initially just bore qualitative changes, but now actually generates them. And that's the mediating of itself. That's what's not explained, accounted for in any of these previous 1831 accounts of how that transition takes place. Does that help with that? That's a good question. Thank you for that. Other comments, questions? All right. Let me say a little bit about shine, then we'll take a break. Right? Just a very little bit about shine. So I think it's always helpful to remind yourself that when he's talking about shine, although he'll say some things that are fairly complicated here about shine, that when he's talking about shine, he's really talking about now, how do we understand being in essence? And just as a matter of reading the text, right, here's roughly how it works. He's going to start in shine by telling you, here's what being is for essence. And then he's going to say, and let's set that aside now, right, let's put it over here, and let's just worry about what essence is for a little bit. And that's what he's going to do with reflection, that's what he's going to do with the determinacies, the essentialities of reflection, all that until he gets to ground. And he's going to give an account of ground. And as part of the account of ground, he's going to say, okay, essences, as by virtue of their nature of what they are as a ground, must appear. Essences must appear. Not they occasionally do, we see them show up sometimes. It's fascinating when we say, no, to be an essence is to appear. And Erscheinung, appearance, is then going to be the new determination of being within essence. So shine initially becomes Erscheinung, yep, right? He's doing that. We could move from mere shine, this kind of guise, this flimsy surface dimension, to being something that is the appearing, the shining of, right? The appearing of essences themselves. So those are grounded appearances, is literally how he defines them, right? They're grounded appearances. So that's where we're headed. But we're going to talk about being just briefly here in these, 4 pages, right at the beginning of the doctrine of essence, as shine, and then we'll look at essence, and because what essence is, we'll have to redetermine what being is. It can't be just shine anymore, it's got to be Erschein. And then we'll get further along than that as we move into the rest of the doctrine of essence. So let's talk about shine. So shine is being as it's necessary and imminently unfolding, shine is being as being's imminent and necessary unfolding demonstrated being to be. It is the surface, the unessential, which has Wesen, essence, for its depth. So think surface, depth, unessential, essential. That's good. That's the way to think here. It's not the ultimate way to think about this stuff, but it's the first way to think about it. So where we're at this moment is, okay, there's a substrate and a state relationship. We saw that back in the doctrine of being. And that's been transformed into the essence and being relationship. Right? Being's now the qualitative states. The quantitative continuum is the substrate. They relate to one another as essence and being, but here being is what? Being is the shine, the unessential of the essential. It's the surface of the depth. So now the nodal line, if you want to put it in those terms, has been pulled apart, right? Has 2 dimensions to it, but it's been pulled apart. Now we see a dimension that's the surface dimension, and the underlying dimension, the depth, which is Wesen, essence. So you can do it in terms of exteriority. Right? Being is the exterior, shine is the exterior, and Wesen, essence, is the interiority. So he'll take on all those determinations here. He's fine with any of those. That's the initial way of thinking about that. The way he technically defines it is on 342. He says here, being is shine, right? This is right in section B, shine. Being is shine. And then he says, I love these sort of pithy, short definitions. What the hell do they mean? At the end of that paragraph, he says, okay, you know what shine is? Here's what it is. It is the negative posited as negative. The negative posited as negative. Now, on its own terms, that's ludicrous, right? It makes no sense. It's this posited as this. Doesn't really, it looks like a tautology. It doesn't really tell you anything, right? It's vacuous and empty. But if you think about it for a moment from where we've been, he's summarizing exactly what he's shown
in the doctrine of being. What had being proved to be? A negative. Doesn't have anything of its own. It negates itself. So now we've rendered that explicit. We've made that possible to see on its own terms. We've seen it at work. So it's now posited as that. It was never posited as that. It was always being that had non-being with it. Right? Throughout the doctrine of being, whenever we talked about being, we always said, well, it's reality and it also has negation. It's discreteness and it also has continuity along. You know, it was always afflicted, affected, it burdened with negation. But what we learned over the course of the doctrine of being is that negation isn't something that reality or discreteness, being, is burdened with. It's what being is. Being just is negation. There is nothing more to it than that. If you want to talk the surface level, what's surface dimensions or what's the epiphenomenal is reality and discreteness. What's really there is negation. So shine is the immediate as posited as non-being itself. That's what he means by the negative posited as a negative. So shine negates itself, or being is negativity. And therefore it is itself, being is itself, only in and through its own negating. Being posited as its own negating. So Hegel is arguing here, is really concluding here, that shine affirms itself as negative and thus stands as a self-relation, as an identity, he says at one point. But that's precisely what essence is. It's a negative self-relation as well. So now being is a self-relation as negative, and essence is a self-relation. As he says here, this should sound familiar, shine and essence are dasselbe, they are the same. This is like the nothing being nothing account. Shine is that through which essence shines, or you could say shine is the shining, to use it in the process language, of essence. As he says on 344, this is the 248 in the German, this is the third full paragraph down. Shine is essence itself in the determinateness of being. Shine is essence itself. It is what essence is in the determination of being. Now, that's about all he wants to say about it, other than this last crazy bit, right in the middle of 345. So let me take a look at this really quickly, and then we'll take a break. This is 345, 249 in the German. This is the second full paragraph down. In the sphere of being, everybody see where I'm at? So this is one of those summary passages where he's telling you, here's what happened in the logical being, and you desperately need these, right, at this point. You need to be like, okay, my God, what happened? Right back then, I need to be reminded. He's telling you, he knows. In the sphere of being, non-being arises over against being. Yeah, I kind of remember something like that, right? Whenever you got reality, you got negation. Whenever you got continuity, you got discreteness. They're alongside one another, right? Being and non-being, they're there, but they're always there, together with one another. In the sphere of being, non-being arises over against being, each equally and immediate, and the truth of both is becoming. In the sphere of essence, so now he's telling you he's drawing a contrast. We have the contrast first of essence and the non-essential, then of essence and shine, the non-essential and the shine being both the leftover of being, what being results in. But, here's where things start moving. These two, and no less the distinction of essence from them, consist solely in this, that essence is taken at first as an immediate, not as it is in itself, namely as an immediacy, which is immediacy as pure immediacy, or absolute negativity. So we at first see essence as what? Shine, which is being in this form. It's just pure negativity. This first immediacy is thus only the determinateness of immediacy. The sublating of this determinacy of essence consists, therefore, in nothing further than showing that the unessential is only shine. The unessential just is the shine. It's the surface dimension. And that essence rather contains this shine, that's the language, we've heard this language before, within itself. So this sounds like, are we reverting back to substrate and state? Right? He doesn't have that language here because, remember, substrate and state was added in 1831. It's not here in 1812, 1813. It sounds like he's getting at least back to that notion. But look at what he does instead. For essence is an infinite self-contained movement. Essence is a movement that determines its immediacy as negativity. Determines its immediacy, determines shine. He's already told us that's what the immediacy of essence is. Determines shine as negativity. And its negativity as immediacy, and thus the shining of itself within itself. There's the essence shines itself, right? It negates itself. And then he gives a name to that. In this, in its self-movement, this is the movement of essence itself, essence is reflection. Now, he knows, he's already warned you about this, so let me just take you back to where he warned you about this. And take a look back on, take a look back on 337, 241 in the German, 337. And he starts off this section by saying the truth of being is essence, right? There's the summary of the transition. Here's what I take myself to be. You can always, when Hegel does this, he's basically saying, here's what I take myself to have shown thus far. It's a summary, declaration, conclusion that I've been able to reach thus far. Not much, but kind of everything up to this point. The truth of being is essence. Being is the immediate, since the goal of knowledge, so notice he immediately starts talking about it in terms of knowledge. That ought to alert you. You ought to say, we haven't been doing it in those terms before, right? We've been doing it in terms of the way being is, not the way we're trying to know being. But he says, since the goal of knowledge is truth, what being is in and for itself, knowledge does not stop at the immediate and its determinations, but penetrates beyond it on the presupposition that behind this being, there still is something other than being itself, and that this background constitutes the truth of being. We want the essence. We want to just know what it is. We want to know what makes something what it is. We want to move from being to essence. That's what we want to do. That's the pathway of knowledge. This cognition is a mediated knowledge, for it is not to be found with and in essence immediately, but starts off from another. We start off from being. Right? This is classic Socratic interaction with someone. You claim this. You're doing the right thing. You're doing the just thing. You're going to go prosecute your father. Why is that the right thing to do? Tell me what justice is. Right? So that's give me the essence of that shows that this is the right thing that you're doing. For it is not to be found with and in essence immediately, but starts off from another, from being, and has a prior way to make. The way starts off from the way that leads over and beyond being, or that rather penetrates into it. Only as much as knowledge recollects itself into itself, and this gathers itself back, right? Out of immediate being does it find essence through this mediation. The German language has kept essence phase in the past participle gewesen of the verb to be, sein, for essence is past, but time is the past, being. There's famous for linguistic analysis. Now look at what he says here. Because so far you're thinking, okay, he's basically telling us that this transition from being to essence we do all the time because we want to know the truth. And to know the truth, we don't just know being, we want to know the essence of being. That's what we're at. So far, so good. Then he says, next paragraph, when this movement is represented, so the movement he's talking about is the movement he just talked about, right? So the pathway of knowledge is represented as a pathway of knowledge. Well, yeah, that's what we've just been talking about, so what's the big deal? This beginning with being and the subsequent advance, which sublates being and arrives at essence as a mediated term, appears to be an activity of cognition. Thinking. We did it. Being didn't do it, we did it. External to being and indifferent to its nature. Now that's a huge red flag from Hegel. Right? That's Hegel saying, I know very well what cognition is. And I know how cognition, the pathway of cognition, the pathway of knowledge, depicts the transition we've just meticulously tried to unpack. That being to essence works because we, the knower, want to know the truth, and the truth isn't to be found merely, we've got to have them, but not merely in being, but in the essence of what those beings are, either the display of, or the manifestation of, or the instantiation. So however we're going to think about the being-essence relationship. But then he says, but that would be extrinsic to being, and being would be indifferent in its nature to that kind of knowing. It's something you could do, but it wouldn't be intrinsic to being itself. But notice, that's not how he ended, right? The doctrine of being, whichever version you take of it, the end of the doctrine of being clearly says, in every last single one of its versions, it says being mediates itself and therefore is essence. Not You want to know what being is, so you start trying to know it, and therefore you have to penetrate into this other dimension known as essence. That's a you thing, not a being thing. So look at what he says now. And this is kind of devastating. Right? But this course is the movement of being itself. What? Yeah, reflection, whereby we start with something and want to know its essence, is something you can do through cognition. It's a thought process, right? It's a knowledge process. It's what epistemology is all based on. Fine, wonderful, grand. We're not doing epistemology here, he's saying. We're doing the ontological underpinnings of any kind of epistemology, any kind of epistemology. And the only way that makes any sense, the only way there would be an essence to penetrate to, is if ontologically essence is there to be had. So what you've got to show is that reflection is a mental operation, sure, but it's that secondarily. He's picked a term which he well knows is a subjective term, a mental operation. We reflect on being to get to essence. And we can do that in a number of different ways. There's been debates about this throughout the history of philosophy. I got it. Whether there is such a thing as essences, there's a debate about that. The nominalists say no, 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 and the realists say, oh, yes, yes, yes. And all that kind of, fine for all that. That's all about cognition, he's saying. Here the real problem is ontological. This course, that being entails essence and is essence, this course is the movement of being itself. It's not indifferent to it, it's what it is. That it is being's nature to recollect itself. That's why that definition of, what is essence? It's recollected being. Right? It's being that negates itself. And that it becomes essence by virtue of this interiorizing. This has been displayed, I've already shown you this, right? He's recalling the end of the first version, 1812 version of the move from being to essence. Has been displayed in being itself. If, therefore, the absolute was at first determined as being, now it is determined as essence. Notice, the absolute, not your little finite cognition, but the absolute is what is defined as essence. Cognition cannot in general stop at the manifold of existence, but neither can it stop at being, pure being. Immediately one is forced into the reflection that this pure being, this negation of everything finite, presupposes recollection, a movement which has distilled immediate existence into pure being. Being thus comes to be determined as essence, as a being in which everything determined and finite is negated. So it is simple, and he goes on with this, right? You can go down that path of cognition, but the only way you get to go down that path of cognition is if there is an ontological pathway to be tread. You don't get to go find essence if essence isn't there to be found. Epistemology fails if there's not an ontology underpinning it. So Hegel is saying, I know the term reflection is an epistemological primary term. I get that, I understand that, but what I'm trying to say to you is that this is a different kind of relation than the relationship between being and non-being that we've seen in being. Because it's a different kind of relation, because non-being is now not just born by being, reality and negation, continuity and discreteness, but it actually is what being is itself. The negation is really definitive and determinative and generative of being itself. Then the proper name for that is reflection. And it's no longer the pathway of knowledge, principally. He's not denying that you can do reflection, right? He's actually saying, this is how it's not possible for you to do reflection. But that's because reflection doesn't just denote a mental operation. It can denote that mental operation, and that mental operation can be successful because there's an ontological movement known as reflection that undergirds it. So that's going to cast this account of reflection that we're about to examine, I think, in a quite different light. Number one, he's going to take things about reflection, and he's going to say things you're going to think, oh, well, that means when we do our mental operation. You have to remember, no, actually, that's secondary to this whole account, right? Yeah, you can talk about it in those terms. Yeah, you can do it that way. And certainly when he's talking about extrinsic, extrinsic reflection, he's talking about determining reflection, borrowing those terms from Kant. Kant certainly was operating in the mental terms. Right? Epistemology. That's absolutely what Kant was doing. And Hegel's not an idiot, he knows that. But he's taking, that's what these passages are about, he's taking that cognitive epistemological terminology and using it in an ontological way. Because he thinks it names ontological processes before, logically prior to, the epistemological cognitive processes of reflection that tread upon it, work by virtue of it. So when he's now going to look at reflection, you should think about that, oh, wait a minute, that's an ontological process he's talking about. All right. Let's take a break, it's 4:49, let's take about a 10-minute break, come back at 4:59, and continue on from there.